Picture this. A group of arrogant high school bullies corner their young English teacher in an empty classroom, phones ready to capture what they think will be the ultimate humiliation video. They're planning to film up her skirt and destroy her career for giving them failing grades. But in less than 2 minutes, these same bullies will be on their knees, deleting their footage, and begging her to keep their darkest secrets buried. This is the story of how Miss Sarah Mitchell turned the tables on Riverside High's most notorious troublemakers, using skills they never knew she possessed, and why you should never underestimate someone based on their quiet exterior. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The October afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of Riverside High School, casting long shadows across the polished linoleum floors. Room 204 sat at the end of the English department hallway, its door slightly ajar as Miss Sarah Mitchell graded papers at her desk. The 28-year-old teacher had only been at Riverside for 6 weeks, but she'd already earned a reputation for being both brilliant and uncompromising. Her students either loved her engaging discussions about literature or despised her refusal to accept mediocre work. There was no middle ground with Ms. Mitchell, and that's exactly how she preferred it. The school building hummed with the quiet energy of after-hours activities. Down the hall, the drama club rehearsed their fall production, while the debate team argued policy points in the library. Most teachers had gone home by now, leaving only a skeleton crew of dedicated educators and ambitious students pursuing their passions. Sarah enjoyed these peaceful moments, when she could focus on her work without the constant interruption of bells and announcements. She discovered that some of her best teaching insights came during these quiet reflection periods. What her students didn't know about Ms. Mitchell was that teaching hadn't been her first career choice. For 5 years before entering education, she'd worked as an investigative journalist for the Hartford Courier, specializing in corruption cases and corporate fraud. She'd learned to read people, to dig beneath surface appearances, and most importantly, to document everything. Her transition to teaching had been born from a desire to shape young minds rather than simply expose society's failures, but her investigative instincts remained razor-sharp. She noticed things other teachers missed, patterns of behavior that revealed deeper truths about her students' lives. Sarah's classroom reflected her personality, organized but warm, intellectual but accessible. Student artwork hung beside quotes from famous authors, and her desk displayed both family photos and journalism awards she'd never mentioned to anyone at school. She believed in maintaining appropriate boundaries with her students, while still showing them she cared about their growth as human beings. Most of her students responded well to this approach, appreciating her honesty and high expectations. However, there were always a few who tested those boundaries, particularly students accustomed to getting their way through intimidation or privilege. Tyler Brooks represented everything Sarah had hoped to change about the American education system. At 17, he stood 6 feet tall with the build of someone who'd been playing basketball since elementary school. His sandy brown hair was always perfectly styled, and his clothes bore the subtle logos of expensive brands his parents could easily afford. Tyler had been the star of Riverside's basketball team since his sophomore year, and college scouts had already started making inquiries about his future plans. Unfortunately, his athletic success had created a sense of entitlement that poisoned his academic attitude. Connor Walsh was Tyler's constant companion, a wiry boy with nervous energy who seemed to live his entire life through his phone's camera lens. He documented everything for social media, from lunch conversations to basketball practice, always searching for content that would boost his online following. His parents owned a successful marketing firm in town, and Connor had absorbed their understanding of how image and perception could be manipulated for personal gain. He was Tyler's unofficial publicist, managing his friend's social media presence. and creating viral content whenever possible. Derek Stone followed Tyler and Connor like a lost puppy, grateful to be included in their inner circle despite contributing little beyond enthusiastic agreement with their schemes. His father worked at the auto repair shop on Main Street, and Derek was painfully aware of the economic gap between his family and his friends. This insecurity made him eager to prove his loyalty through increasingly reckless behavior, never considering the potential consequences of his actions. His desperation for acceptance made him the perfect accomplice for whatever plans Tyler might devise. Mason Reed completed their group, bringing old money arrogance and a family name that carried weight in Millbrook's social circles. His great-grandfather had founded the town's largest employer, and subsequent generations had maintained their influence through strategic investments and political connections. Mason had learned early that rules were suggestions for people like him, and consequences were things that happened to others. His parents' sizable donations to the school district had smoothed over numerous incidents throughout his academic career, creating a pattern of behavior that would prove dangerous when applied to the wrong target. The four boys had been friends since middle school, bonded by shared privilege and a mutual disdain for authority figures who dared to challenge them. They'd developed a sophisticated system for avoiding academic consequences, trading on Tyler's athletic importance, Connor's technical skills, Mason's family connections, and Derek's willingness to take blame when necessary. Most teachers at Riverside had learned to accommodate their behavior rather than face the political headaches that came with confronting influential families. Ms. Mitchell, however, had proven immune to their usual tactics. When Tyler submitted a plagiarized essay on Shakespearean themes, she'd given him a 0 without hesitation. When Connor tried to film a class discussion for his social media without permission, she'd confiscated his phone and assigned him detention. Mason's attempts to intimidate her with veiled references to his family's importance had been met with polite but firm reminders about appropriate classroom behavior. Most frustrating of all, Derek's puppy dog expressions and fake apologies had failed to earn him the sympathy that worked on other teachers. Their resentment had been building for weeks, fueled by a series of academic setbacks that threatened their carefully maintained grade point averages. Tyler's college prospects depended on maintaining athletic eligibility, which required passing grades in all classes. Connor's parents had threatened to revoke his car privileges if his English grade didn't improve. Mason faced the humiliation of potentially being removed from the National Honor Society, while Derek simply couldn't afford to fail another class without facing serious consequences at home. The breaking point had come that morning when Ms. Mitchell handed back their latest assignment, a comparative analysis of modern and classical literature. All four boys had received failing grades, with detailed comments explaining exactly why their work was unacceptable. Tyler's paper showed clear evidence of being purchased online. Connor's was filled with unsupported opinions presented as facts. Mason's demonstrated a complete misunderstanding of the assignment requirements, and Derek's was simply incomplete. Other teachers might have offered extra credit opportunities or grade curves, but Ms. Mitchell had made it clear that she expected them to redo the work properly or accept the consequences. During lunch, their conversation had quickly turned to revenge fantasies and strategies for forcing Ms. Mitchell to change their grades. Tyler, accustomed to getting his way through various forms of pressure, suggested they needed leverage over her. Connor, always thinking in terms of viral content, proposed creating embarrassing footage that could destroy her reputation. Mason, drawing on his family's experience with corporate warfare, recommended finding something compromising they could use for blackmail. Derek, eager to contribute, suggested they wait until she was alone and vulnerable. The plan they eventually devised was both crude and calculated, reflecting their toxic combination of adolescent impulsivity and privileged entitlement. They would wait until after school, when the building was mostly empty, then corner Ms. Mitchell in her classroom. Connor would film while Tyler and Mason created a distraction, allowing Derek to position himself for upskirt footage they could use to humiliate her. If she tried to report them, they would claim she'd dressed inappropriately and had been asking for it. If she wanted the footage deleted, she would need to change their grades and ease up on her impossible standards. As the final bell rang and students began filtering out of the building, the 4 boys lingered in the hallway outside room 204, watching through the partially open door as Miss Mitchell settled in for her usual after-school grading session. She'd changed from her morning dress into more comfortable clothes for the long evening ahead. Dark jeans, a flowing blouse, and flat shoes that allowed her to move around the classroom easily. Her long brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore the wire-rimmed glasses she preferred for detailed work. Connor checked his phone's recording settings while Tyler reviewed their plan one final time. Mason positioned himself near the door to watch for potential witnesses, while Derek fidgeted nervously with his backpack straps. They'd done similar things before to substitute teachers and student teachers, always managing to avoid serious consequences through their family's influence and their ability to present a united front against any accusations. This felt different, though, because Ms. Mitchell had already proven herself immune to their usual manipulation tactics. The hallway grew quieter as the last few students and teachers departed for the day. Custodial staff wouldn't begin their rounds for another hour, and the administration had left immediately after the final bell. It was the perfect time for their plan, with minimal risk of interruption and maximum potential for achieving their goals. Tyler nodded to his friends, took a deep breath, and pushed open the classroom door with false confidence masking his underlying nervousness about confronting someone who'd consistently outmaneuvered them. Intellectually, Ms. Mitchell looked up from her papers as the 4 boys entered her classroom, immediately sensing the shift in atmosphere that accompanied their presence. She'd dealt with enough hostile sources during her journalism career to recognize when someone approached with malicious intent. Her expression remained neutral, but her posture subtly shifted as she prepared for whatever confrontation they had planned. Years of investigating dangerous subjects had taught her to trust her instincts about threatening situations. "Gentlemen," she said calmly, setting down her pen and giving them her full attention, "what can I help you with this afternoon?" Her tone was professional but cautious, the same voice she'd used when interviewing corrupt politicians who thought they could intimidate her into dropping her investigations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She noticed Connor's phone in his hand, Tyler's aggressive stance, Mason's smirk, and Derek's nervous energy, reading their body language like a journalist assessing potential sources. Tyler stepped forward, his basketball player's confidence on full display as he attempted to establish dominance in the interaction. "We need to talk about our grades, Miss Mitchell. We think there might have been some mistakes on our last assignment." His voice carried the expectation of compliance that had worked with other teachers, but his eyes betrayed his awareness that this conversation might not go as planned. Sarah leaned back in her chair, maintaining eye contact with Tyler while keeping the other 3 boys in her peripheral vision. She'd interviewed drug dealers and mob lawyers who'd tried similar intimidation tactics, and she knew that showing fear or uncertainty would only encourage more aggressive behavior. "I don't make mistakes when it comes to grading," she replied evenly. "Your work was evaluated fairly based on the assignment criteria we discussed in class." Connor raised his phone slightly, angling it toward Miss Mitchell's desk while pretending to check messages. His social media instincts told him that capturing her initial reaction would be crucial for their narrative later. Tyler moved closer to her desk, using his height advantage to loom over her in a way that had intimidated other teachers into reconsidering their positions. Mason positioned himself near the windows, blocking her view of the hallway while maintaining plausible deniability about his role in whatever was about to happen. "See, that's where we disagree," Tyler continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. We think you've been unfair to us from the beginning. Maybe because we're athletes, or maybe because you just don't like students who have better things to do than obsess over English class." He placed his hands on her desk, leaning forward, in a gesture designed to make her feel trapped and overwhelmed. Ms. Mitchell remained perfectly still, her journalistic training helping her assess the situation while planning her response. She'd been threatened by people far more dangerous than high school bullies, and she'd learned that panic was the enemy of good decision-making. Her eyes moved briefly to Connor's phone, confirming her suspicion that they were recording the interaction, then returned to Tyler's face with an expression that revealed nothing about her internal calculations. "Your grades reflect the quality of your work, nothing more," she said, her voice maintaining its calm professionalism despite the increasingly tense atmosphere. "If you'd like to discuss specific assignment feedback, I'm happy to schedule individual conferences during my office hours tomorrow." She deliberately offered them a graceful exit from the confrontation, testing whether they were actually interested in academic improvement or had other motives for cornering her alone. Derek, following their predetermined plan, began moving toward the side of her desk where he could potentially position his phone for upskirt footage. His nervous energy made his movements obvious to someone trained in observation, but his three friends were too focused on their own roles to notice his lack of subtlety. Mason stepped away from the windows, ready to create the distraction they'd discussed, while Connor adjusted his phone angle to capture what they expected would be Miss Mitchell's humiliation and submission. "We don't want to schedule conferences," Tyler said, his voice rising slightly as his frustration with her calm demeanor became apparent. "We want you to fix our grades right now, or we're going to have a problem." The threat was implicit but clear, backed by his physical presence and the knowledge that they outnumbered her 4-1 in an empty classroom. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a hardening that Tyler might have recognized if he'd been paying attention to anything beyond his own aggressive posturing. She'd reached the point in the conversation where her journalistic instincts began overriding her teacher persona, activating skills and knowledge these boys couldn't possibly understand. Her fingers moved almost imperceptibly toward her laptop's keyboard, a gesture so subtle that none of them noticed it happening. "I see," she said quietly, her tone becoming even more neutral as she processed the full scope of their intentions. "And what exactly do you think this problem might involve?" She was giving them one final opportunity to reconsider their course of action, while simultaneously beginning to implement countermeasures they wouldn't understand until it was too late. Connor held up his phone more openly now, abandoning any pretense about checking messages as he began recording their confrontation. Tyler's confidence increased as he interpreted her question as a sign of weakness, while Mason moved closer to provide additional intimidation. Derek continued his awkward positioning, trying to angle his phone toward her legs without being obvious about his intentions. None of them noticed that Miss Mitchell's laptop screen had quietly activated, or that her seemingly casual hand movements were actually typing commands with practiced efficiency. Tyler's smirk widened as he sensed what he interpreted as hesitation in Miss Mitchell's response. In his experience, adults always back down when confronted with the reality of his social status and physical presence. Riverside High operated on an unspoken hierarchy that placed star athletes at the apex of student power, and Tyler had learned to wield that influence like a weapon against anyone who dared challenge his authority. Teachers, administrators, and even some parents had fallen in line when faced with the prospect of disrupting the basketball team's championship aspirations. The culture at Riverside High had been carefully cultivated over decades to prioritize athletic achievement above almost everything else. Championship banners lined the gymnasium walls, and the trophy cases in the main hallway gleamed with evidence of sporting success that brought prestige and funding to the district. The school board, composed largely of former athletes and sports boosters, understood that winning teams attracted the kind of community support that translated into tax levy approvals and property value increases. This created a protective ecosystem around star players that insulated them from the normal consequences of poor behavior or academic performance. Connor adjusted his phone's position to ensure he was capturing the optimal angle for their planned humiliation video. His social media experience had taught him the importance of visual storytelling, and he knew that the contrast between Ms. Mitchell's initial confidence and her eventual submission would create the kind of compelling content that generated massive engagement. He'd already mentally composed the caption that would accompany their post, something that would paint her as an uptight teacher who got what she deserved for thinking she was better than her students. The young man had built his online following by documenting the exploits of his friend group, carefully editing their activities to present them as harmless pranks rather than the calculated cruelty they actually represented. His parents, both successful marketing professionals, had unknowingly provided him with sophisticated understanding of narrative construction and audience manipulation. Connor knew exactly how to frame events to generate sympathy for his friends while vilifying their targets, creating viral content that reinforced their social dominance. Mason watched the interaction unfold with the detached satisfaction of someone accustomed to seeing obstacles removed through the application of pressure. His family's position in Millbrook society had taught him that most problems could be solved through a combination of intimidation and influence, and he fully expected Ms. Mitchell to follow the pattern established by every other authority figure who'd initially resisted their demands. The Reed family had been moving pieces around Millbrook's social and political chessboard for 3 generations, and Mason had absorbed their understanding of power dynamics through countless dinner table conversations about business negotiations and political maneuvering. The boy's confidence stemmed from a lifetime of watching his parents navigate complex situations by identifying leverage points and applying pressure until opposition crumbled. He'd seen teachers reassigned, coaches fired, and administrators transferred when they'd proven insufficiently accommodating to his family's interests. Mason understood that Ms. Mitchell's resistance was simply the opening gambit in a negotiation that would inevitably end with her capitulation, because people like the Reeds always found ways to get what they wanted from people like her. Derek's nervous energy increased as he attempted to position his phone for the upskirt footage that would serve as their ultimate leverage against Ms. Mitchell. His hands shook slightly as he tried to appear casual while maneuvering into them perfect angle, his inexperience with this type of activity making his movements clumsy and obvious to anyone paying attention. The boy's desperation to prove his worth to his more affluent friends had driven him to increasingly degrading behavior, each transgression justified by his need to maintain his position within their group. His family's financial struggles had created a deep well of insecurity that made him vulnerable to manipulation by Tyler, Connor, and Mason. Derek's father worked long hours at the auto shop for wages that barely covered their basic expenses, and his mother cleaned houses for wealthy families who treated her as invisible. The boy had learned to swallow his pride and endure humiliation in exchange for access to opportunities and experiences his family couldn't afford, creating a psychological dependence on his friends' approval that overrode his moral compass. Ms. Mitchell observed their positioning and behavior with the analytical detachment she'd developed during her journalism career. Her training had taught her to recognize the signs of coordinated deception, and she could see that this confrontation had been planned in advance rather than arising from spontaneous frustration about their grades. The boy's body language revealed their assigned roles in whatever scheme they'd devised, and their overconfidence suggested they'd successfully employed similar tactics against other targets in the past. Sarah's mind automatically began cataloging evidence and documenting details that might prove important later. Her laptop's discrete recording software had already begun capturing audio and video of the encounter, insurance against whatever false narrative the boys might attempt to construct afterward. Years of investigating corruption had taught her that powerful people often tried to rewrite history when their schemes went wrong, and she'd learned to protect herself by maintaining meticulous records of every interaction with potentially hostile subjects. The classroom's afternoon lighting cast long shadows across the floor, creating dramatic contrasts that emphasized the tension building between teacher and students. Outside the windows, the parking lot was nearly empty except for a few cars belonging to staff members working late on various projects. The isolation that the boys had counted on for their plan was exactly what Miss Mitchell needed to handle the situation without worrying about collateral damage to innocent bystanders who might stumble into the confrontation. Tyler leaned further across her desk, invading her personal space in a calculated attempt to trigger the fight-or-flight response that had worked against other teachers. His basketball training had taught him to use his size and athleticism as psychological weapons, intimidating opponents before physical competition even began. The coach had always emphasized the importance of mental warfare in establishing dominance, lessons that Tyler had learned to apply far beyond the basketball court. "You know what your problem is, Miss Mitchell," Tyler said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty that came naturally to someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. "You think you're better than us just because you went to some fancy college and read a bunch of books. But you're really just a failed journalist who couldn't make it in the real world. So now you're stuck here taking out your frustrations on kids who actually have futures." The personal attack was designed to wound her professionally and emotionally, drawing on information the boys had gathered from online searches about her background. Tyler had learned that most adults had sensitive areas that could be exploited when direct intimidation failed, and he'd become skilled at identifying and targeting those vulnerabilities. His research into Miss Mitchell's career transition had provided him with ammunition he was confident would break through her composed exterior. Connor's phone captured Tyler's verbal assault while he prepared for the climactic moment, when Derek's footage would provide them with the ultimate leverage. The social media-savvy teenager understood that the sequence of events needed to build dramatically toward a satisfying conclusion, with Miss Mitchell's initial resistance making her eventual submission more compelling for their audience. His editing skills would allow him to craft a narrative that painted them as justified rebels standing up to an abusive authority figure. Mason stepped closer to the desk, adding his presence to the intimidating wall of teenage masculinity surrounding Ms. Mitchell's position. His expensive cologne and designer clothes marked him as someone accustomed to getting his way through the subtle application of social and economic pressure. The boy's family had taught him that most people were impressed by displays of wealth and status, and he'd learned to use these advantages to bend others to his will without resorting to obvious threats. "Maybe we should discuss this more privately," Mason suggested with false reasonableness, his tone implying consequences that would extend far beyond the classroom if she continued to resist their demands. "My family knows a lot of people in this district, and they might be very interested to hear about a teacher who seems to have some kind of personal vendetta against successful students. I'm sure the school board would want to investigate why you're trying to destroy the futures of kids who bring so much positive attention to Riverside High." The veiled threat carried the weight of institutional power that had protected the boys throughout their academic careers. Mason's family had cultivated relationships with key decision-makers in the school district, creating a network of influence that could be activated whenever their interests were threatened. His parents had always taught him that subtle pressure was more effective than obvious coercion, because it allowed targets to rationalize their submission as reasonable compromise rather than forced capitulation. Derek continued his awkward maneuvering, his phone's camera now positioned to capture the footage they needed to complete their scheme. His sweaty palms made it difficult to maintain a steady grip on the device, and his guilty conscience caused him to avoid eye contact with Ms. Mitchell, even as he prepared to violate her privacy in the most degrading way possible. The boy's moral discomfort was overridden by his terror of losing his place within the group, because isolation at Riverside High meant social death for someone from his economic background. Ms. Mitchell remained perfectly still throughout their escalating intimidation campaign, her expression revealing nothing about the thoughts racing through her mind. Her journalism experience had taught her to maintain composure under pressure, while simultaneously gathering intelligence about her opponent's capabilities and intentions. She could see that the boys had underestimated both her ability to recognize their scheme and her capacity to respond effectively when threatened. Sarah's fingers continued their subtle movement across her laptop's keyboard, activating programs and accessing databases that the boys couldn't possibly imagine existed. Her investigative background had provided her with tools and skills that extended far beyond traditional teaching resources, and she'd maintained connections within law enforcement and media circles that could prove invaluable if the situation required external intervention. The boy's assumption that she was helpless and isolated would prove to be a critical miscalculation. "I appreciate your concern about my teaching methods," Ms. Mitchell said with carefully controlled calm, her voice betraying none of the anger building beneath her professional facade. "However, I'm afraid your grades accurately reflect the quality of work you've submitted. If you gentlemen would like to improve your academic performance, I suggest you focus on meeting the assignment requirements rather than attempting to intimidate your instructor." Her refusal to show fear or submit to their pressure visibly frustrated Tyler, whose experience had taught him that adults always cracked under sufficient stress. The basketball star had built his reputation on his ability to overwhelm opposition through relentless aggression, and Ms. Mitchell's continued resistance challenged his understanding of how power dynamics worked. His friends were depending on him to break through her defenses, and their expectant stares added pressure that made him increasingly desperate to regain control of the situation. Connor's phone continued recording as tension filled the classroom. Like a gathering storm, the teenager's social media instincts told him that they were approaching the climactic moment that would define their viral video, and he positioned himself to capture the best possible angle of Miss Mitchell's anticipated breakdown. His experience creating content had taught him that audience engagement peaked during moments of dramatic transformation, and he fully expected to document her transition from confident authority figure to humiliated victim. Mason's family connections had always provided him with a safety net that allowed him to take risks other students couldn't afford, and his confidence in that protection made him bolder than wisdom would have suggested. The boy's privileged upbringing had insulated him from the real-world consequences that shaped most people's behavior, creating a dangerous disconnect between his actions and his understanding of potential outcomes. His parents' influence had always been sufficient to clean up his messes, leading him to believe that no situation was too extreme for their family's power to handle. Derek's phone finally achieved the angle he'd been seeking, positioned to capture intimate footage that would serve as their ultimate weapon against Ms. Mitchell's resistance. His heart pounded with anxiety and shame as he prepared to cross a line that would forever change his relationship with his own conscience, but his fear of social isolation overrode his moral objections. The boy's desperation to maintain his place within the group had gradually eroded his ethical boundaries, leading him toward increasingly serious crimes in service of friendships built on mutual exploitation. The four boys had reached the point of no return in their scheme, committed to a course of action that would have devastating consequences regardless of the outcome. Their plan depended on Ms. Mitchell's submission to their demands, but they'd made no provision for the possibility that she might possess resources and capabilities beyond their understanding. The entitled arrogance that had protected them throughout their academic careers was about to encounter a force they'd never anticipated, and their lack of preparation would prove catastrophic. Ms. Mitchell's laptop screen displayed information that would have terrified the boys if they'd been able to see it. Connections and capabilities that transformed her from isolated victim to formidable adversary. Her journalism background had provided her with investigative tools and law enforcement contacts that could unravel their lives with surgical precision, while her teaching position gave her legitimate authority to impose academic and disciplinary consequences they couldn't escape. Through family influence, the boys' assumption that she was powerless would prove to be the foundation of their downfall. Sarah had spent her career exposing corruption and holding powerful people accountable for their actions, developing skills and instincts that served her well in recognizing and responding to threats. The boys' crude intimidation tactics were familiar territory for someone who'd faced down drug dealers, corrupt politicians, and corporate executives willing to use violence to protect their interests. Their amateur-hour approach to coercion would prove no match for someone who'd survived and thrived in genuinely dangerous situations. The classroom had become a pressure cooker of teenage arrogance and adult competence, with both sides committed to courses of action that could only end in decisive victory for one and crushing defeat for the other. Tyler's leadership of the group had been built on his ability to intimidate and manipulate others, but he was about to discover that those skills were useless against someone who understood power dynamics at a level he couldn't comprehend. Connor's social media savvy had convinced him that he could control the narrative regardless of what happened, but he was unprepared for someone who'd spent years crafting stories that could destroy reputations and end careers. Mason's family wealth and connections had always provided him with protection from consequences, but that safety net was about to prove inadequate against someone who understood how to navigate institutional power structures with professional expertise. Derek's desperate loyalty to his friends had led him toward criminal behavior that would haunt him, regardless of whether their scheme succeeded or failed. The boys had stumbled into a confrontation with someone whose capabilities far exceeded their ability to comprehend or counter, and their overconfidence had blinded them to the warning signs that might have saved them from disaster. Miss Mitchell's calm demeanor masked a growing anger that was intensifying with each passing moment of their intimidation campaign. Her professional training had taught her to channel rage into focused action rather than emotional outburst, and she was methodically preparing responses that would address both the immediate threat and the long-term need to prevent future incidents. The boys' assumption that her composure indicated weakness would prove to be a fundamental misunderstanding of how dangerous people actually behaved when threatened. The afternoon sun continued its westward journey, casting longer shadows through the classroom windows as the confrontation approached its inevitable climax. Outside, Riverside High's campus remained largely empty except for scattered vehicles belonging to staff members and students involved in after-school activities. The isolation that had encouraged the boys to implement their scheme was exactly what Ms. Mitchell needed to handle the situation without concerning herself with witnesses or collateral damage that might complicate her response. Tyler's frustration with her continued resistance was beginning to show in his body language and vocal tone, signs that the situation was escalating beyond his ability to control through normal intimidation tactics. His basketball training had taught him to maintain composure under pressure, but facing an opponent who refused to acknowledge his dominance was triggering anxiety and anger that threatened to overwhelm his strategic thinking. The star athlete was discovering that his usual tools for handling opposition were inadequate against someone who operated by different rules than those that governed high school social dynamics. Connor's social media experience had convinced him that every situation could be manipulated through careful presentation and narrative control, but he was beginning to sense that their target possessed capabilities that extended beyond his understanding of normal adult behavior. The teenager's confidence in his ability to create compelling content was being undermined by Miss Mitchell's refusal to play the victim role that was essential to their planned story. His growing unease suggested that their scheme might not unfold according to the script they'd developed. Mason's privileged background had insulated him from situations where his family's influence was insufficient to guarantee favorable outcomes. and he was experiencing the unfamiliar sensation of facing an opponent who seemed unimpressed by the implied threats that usually ensured compliance. The boy's understanding of power dynamics was based on transactions and negotiations rather than genuine conflict, leaving him unprepared for someone who might be willing to accept losses in order to inflict greater damage on her opponents. Derek's moral discomfort was increasing as the moment to implement their plan approached, but his fear of social isolation continued to override his ethical objections to their scheme. The boy's hands shook as he prepared to record footage that would forever mark him as someone willing to commit serious crimes for the approval of people who viewed him as expendable. His desperation to maintain his position within the group was leading him toward actions that would destroy his self-respect regardless of whether their plan succeeded or failed. The tension in room 204 had reached a breaking point as Tyler decided to escalate their intimidation campaign beyond verbal threats. His experience with weaker opponents had taught him that physical dominance usually shattered whatever resistance remained after psychological pressure failed to achieve the desired results. The basketball star moved around Miss Mitchell's desk with predatory confidence, positioning himself between her and the classroom door while his friends maintained their assigned roles in the coordinated assault on her authority. Miss Mitchell tracked Tyler's movement with the analytical detachment of someone who'd faced far more dangerous adversaries during her journalism career. Her training had taught her to recognize the escalation patterns that preceded violence, and she could see that the boys had moved beyond improvisation into the execution of a predetermined plan designed to corner and humiliate her. The classroom's layout provided several potential escape routes, but she had no intention of running from teenage bullies who'd mistaken her professional composure for weakness or fear. Connor raised his phone higher, abandoning any pretense of discretion as he began openly filming the confrontation with the eager anticipation of someone expecting to capture compelling content. His social media instincts told him that Tyler's physical intimidation would finally break through Ms. Michelle's resistance, providing the dramatic transformation that would make their video irresistible to online audiences. The teenager's experience creating viral content had taught him that viewers craved moments of genuine emotion, particularly when authority figures were revealed to be vulnerable and human beneath their professional facades. The young man had built his online following by documenting situations where established hierarchies were challenged or overturned, carefully editing events to create narratives that resonated with audiences who felt powerless in their own lives. Connor understood that Ms. Mitchell's eventual submission would serve as wish fulfillment for viewers who'd fantasized about putting arrogant teachers in their place, transforming their crude intimidation scheme into content that could generate millions of views and establish his reputation as a creator willing to push boundaries others wouldn't cross. Mason stepped closer to the windows, blocking the view from the hallway, while maintaining his position as the group's lookout for potential witnesses who might interrupt their plan. His family's experience with sensitive negotiations had taught him the importance of controlling information flow and preventing unwanted scrutiny during delicate operations. The boys' confidence in their scheme stemmed from careful preparation and contingency, planning that accounted for various scenarios they might encounter during the confrontation. His privileged upbringing had provided him with sophisticated understanding of risk management and damage control, lessons learned from watching his parents navigate complex business deals and political relationships. Mason believed their plan was foolproof because they'd identified Ms. Mitchell's vulnerabilities and developed multiple pressure points they could exploit if initial intimidation proved insufficient. The boy's family had always taught him that success required thorough preparation and the willingness to use whatever leverage was necessary to achieve desired outcomes. Derek's positioning finally achieved the angle he needed to capture the upskirt footage that would serve as their ultimate weapon against Miss Michelle's continued resistance. His phone's camera was now directed toward her chair with clear line of sight to record intimate imagery without her knowledge or consent. The boy's hands trembled with anxiety and shame as he prepared to cross a legal and moral boundary that would forever change his relationship with his own conscience. But his terror of social isolation overrode every ethical objection his mind could generate. The young man's desperation to maintain his place within the group had gradually eroded his moral foundations through a series of increasingly serious transgressions that each seemed minor compared to the social death that awaited him if he lost their protection. Derek had learned to rationalize his participation in their schemes by focusing on the benefits of inclusion rather than the harm they inflicted on their targets. His family's financial struggles had made him acutely aware of how quickly circumstances could change, creating a psychological dependency on his friends' approval that made him willing to commit serious crimes rather than face isolation. Ms. Mitchell remained perfectly still in her chair, her expression revealing nothing about the rapid calculations taking place behind her calm exterior. Her laptop screen displayed information that would have sent the boys fleeing in terror if they'd possessed the technical knowledge to understand what they were seeing. But their ignorance of her true capabilities was about to prove catastrophic for their futures. The woman they'd dismissed as a powerless educator was actually a highly skilled investigator with resources and connections that extended far beyond the academic world they thought they understood. Sarah's journalism background had required her to develop expertise in digital forensics and cybersecurity, skills that proved invaluable when investigating subjects who attempted to hide their activities behind technological barriers. Her laptop contained sophisticated software packages that could penetrate most amateur security measures, and her contact database included law enforcement officials, private investigators, and cybersecurity experts who owed her favors from previous collaborations on sensitive cases. The boys' assumption that their plan would remain secret was about to be shattered by someone who understood information warfare at a professional level. Tyler reached across her desk to grab a framed photograph of her family, his action designed to demonstrate his physical control over her personal space while sending a subtle threat about his willingness to extend their intimidation beyond the classroom. The basketball star had learned that targeting emotional attachments often proved more effective than direct threats, because it forced opponents to consider consequences that extended beyond their own well-being. His fingers closed around the silver frame containing images of Ms. Mitchell's parents and younger sister, people who had nothing to do with his academic failures, but who could potentially be drawn into his campaign of harassment. "Nice family," Tyler said with false admiration, his tone carrying implications that made his meaning crystal clear despite the seemingly innocent words. It would be terrible if something happened to damage their reputation in the community. You know how fast gossip spreads in a small town like Millbrook, especially when it involves teachers who might be doing inappropriate things with their students. The threat was carefully constructed to sound like concern, while actually promising destruction if she continued to resist their demands. His athletic training had taught him to identify and exploit opponents' psychological weaknesses, skills he'd learned to apply in academic and social situations where physical competition wasn't appropriate. Tyler understood that most adults could be controlled through threats to their reputation or family members, because they had more to lose than teenagers who could rely on parental protection and the juvenile justice system's reluctance to impose serious consequences. His experience manipulating substitute teachers and teachers had convinced him that all educators would eventually submit when faced with sufficient pressure. Connor's phone captured Tyler's implicit threat while he prepared for the climactic moment when Derek's footage would provide them with ironclad leverage over Miss A. Mitchell's future behavior. The teenager's social media experience had taught him that successful content required careful pacing and dramatic reveals that kept audiences engaged throughout the entire video. His editing skills would allow him to craft a narrative that presented their intimidation campaign as justified rebellion against an abusive authority figure who'd brought her troubles upon herself through unreasonable academic standards. The young man had studied viral videos that documented similar confrontations between students and teachers, analyzing the elements that generated massive engagement and positive audience response. Connor understood that viewers wanted to see arrogant educators brought down to earth through clever schemes that exposed their hypocrisy and vulnerability. His confidence in their plans stemmed from his belief that he could manipulate public opinion regardless of the specific events that unfolded, because his technical skills would allow him to edit reality into whatever narrative served their purposes. Mason moved closer to Ms. Mitchell's desk, adding his presence to the intimidating wall of teenage masculinity that surrounded her position. His expensive clothing and confident demeanor marked him as someone accustomed to getting his way through. The subtle application of social and economic pressure. The boy's family had taught him that most conflicts could be resolved through careful negotiation backed by implied consequences, and he fully expected Miss Mitchell to recognize the futility of continued resistance once she understood the full scope of their resources and determination. "We're not unreasonable people, Ms. Mitchell," Mason said with false reasonableness, his tone suggesting compromise while his body language communicated threat. "All we want is fair treatment in your classroom, and maybe some recognition that your current grading policies are having a negative impact on students who bring positive attention to Riverside High. I'm sure we can reach an understanding that benefits everyone involved, assuming you're willing to be flexible about your impossible standards." His family's business experience had taught him to present ultimatums as reasonable requests while making the consequences of refusal absolutely clear to the target. Mason had watched his parents negotiate complex deals, where the appearance of fairness was essential to maintaining their reputation, even when the actual terms heavily favored their position. The boy believed that Ms. Mitchell would eventually recognize the wisdom of compromise once she fully understood the scope of opposition she faced and the limited options available for resolving their conflict. Derek's phone camera finally achieved perfect positioning to capture the intimate footage they needed to complete their leverage over Miss Mitchell's future compliance. His device was now recording without her knowledge or consent, documenting imagery that could destroy her career and reputation if released to the public. The boy's moral anguish was overwhelming as he crossed into criminal territory that would haunt him regardless of whether their scheme succeeded. But his terror of social isolation continued to override every ethical objection his conscience could generate. The young man's finger hovered over his phone's record button as he prepared to commit what he knew was a serious crime against someone who'd never personally wronged him. Derek's participation in their scheme was motivated entirely by his desperate need to maintain his position within the group, because losing their protection would mean facing the casual cruelty of Riverside High's social hierarchy without any allies or resources. His family's economic circumstances had made him acutely aware of how quickly life could become unbearable when stripped of social connections and opportunities. Miss Mitchell's laptop screen continued displaying information that revealed the true scope of her capabilities and resources. Data streams that connected her to law enforcement databases, private investigation networks, and media contacts who could destroy the boy's futures with surgical precision. Her journalism background had required her to develop expertise in areas that extended far beyond traditional academic preparation, skills that proved invaluable when facing threats from subjects who'd underestimated her ability to gather intelligence and coordinate responses to hostile behavior. Sarah's contact database included cybersecurity experts who could trace digital communications back to their sources, law enforcement officials who specialized in crimes against educators, and investigative journalists who'd built their careers exposing corruption and abuse of power. The boys' assumption that their plan would remain secret was about to be challenged by someone who understood information warfare at a level that made their amateur intimidation campaign seem pathetically inadequate by comparison. The classrooms. Atmosphere had become suffocating as four teenage boys prepared to implement their scheme against someone whose true capabilities remained hidden beneath a carefully maintained professional facade. Tyler's leadership of their group was built on his ability to identify and exploit weakness in opponents who lacked the resources or determination to resist his demands. But he was about to discover that those tactics were useless against someone who'd survived and thrived in genuinely dangerous situations throughout her previous career. Connor's confidence in his ability to control public perception through selective editing and narrative manipulation was about to encounter someone who understood media dynamics at a professional level that made his social media expertise seem amateurish. Mason's family wealth and political connections had always provided him with protection from consequences, but that safety net was inadequate against someone who'd spent years investigating and exposing corruption among people far more powerful than small-town aristocrats. Derek's desperate loyalty to friends who viewed him as expendable was leading him toward criminal behavior that would destroy his future regardless of their scheme's outcome. The boy's willingness to commit serious crimes for the approval of people who didn't genuinely care about his well-being demonstrated the psychological damage caused by his prolonged exposure to their toxic influence and his family's economic vulnerability. Miss Mitchell's calm demeanor masked a growing fury that was being channeled into focused preparation for responses that would address both the immediate threat and the long-term need to protect other potential victims from similar attacks. Her professional training had taught her to transform anger into strategic action rather than emotional outburst, and she was methodically developing a plan that would neutralize their current scheme while ensuring they never again felt confident enough to target vulnerable educators or students. The boys had reached the point of no return in their intimidation campaign, committed to actions that would have devastating consequences regardless of whether they achieved their immediate objectives. Their plan depended on Miss Mitchell's submission to pressure that seemed overwhelming from their limited perspective, but they'd made no provision for the possibility that she possessed resources and capabilities that extended far beyond their understanding of normal academic authority. Tyler stepped even closer to her chair, using his height and athletic build to loom over her in a gesture designed to trigger the fight-or-flight response that had broken the resistance of every other adult he'd targeted. His basketball training had taught him to use psychological intimidation to gain advantage before physical competition began, lessons he'd learned to apply in academic and social situations where his athletic prowess wasn't directly relevant. The star player's confidence stemmed from his unbroken record of success enforcing compliance from teachers, administrators, and parents who initially tried to hold him accountable for his behavior. "Last chance, Ms. Mitchell," Tyler said with menacing calm, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. "You can change our grades and make this whole problem disappear, or you can find out what happens to teachers who think they're too good to work with students who actually matter to the school. College scouts don't care about English grades. Anyway, so why are you making this so difficult for everyone involved?" His words revealed the entitled arrogance that had been carefully cultivated throughout his academic career by adults who prioritized athletic success over character development or academic integrity. Tyler genuinely believed that his basketball skills granted him special privileges that should exempt him from normal academic standards, and his confusion about Miss Mitchell's resistance stemmed from his inability to comprehend that some people couldn't be intimidated or bought regardless of the pressure applied against them. Connor's phone captured Tyler's ultimatum while the teenager prepared to document what he expected would be Miss Mitchell's inevitable capitulation to their superior numbers and social position. His social media experience had taught him that successful content required building tension toward a satisfying climax, where established hierarchies were overturned and authority figures were revealed to be powerless when confronted by determined opposition. The young man's editing skills would allow him to transform their crude intimidation scheme into compelling narrative that resonated with audiences who felt oppressed by similar authority figures in their own lives. Mason positioned himself to block any potential escape route while maintaining plausible deniability about his role in whatever was about to unfold. His family's experience with sensitive negotiations had taught him the importance of maintaining legal distance from obviously criminal activity while still contributing to the overall pressure campaign. The boys' confidence in their approach stemmed from careful risk assessment that accounted for various scenarios they might encounter and contingency plans that would protect him from serious consequences regardless of the outcome. Derek's finger finally pressed his phone's record button, officially beginning the documentation of criminal activity that would serve as evidence against him, regardless of whether their scheme achieved its intended objectives. His hands shook as he crossed into territory that violated both legal statutes and moral boundaries he'd once considered inviolable. But his terror of social isolation continued to override every ethical objection his conscience could generate. The boy's desperation to maintain his position within the group had led him to commit serious crimes against someone who'd never personally wronged him. Miss Mitchell remained perfectly motionless in her chair as the four boys implemented their coordinated assault on her authority and dignity, her expression revealing nothing about the rapid analysis taking place behind her calm exterior. Her laptop screen displayed information that would have terrified them if they'd possessed the technical sophistication to understand what they were seeing, but their ignorance of her true capabilities was about to prove catastrophic for their futures and reputations. Sarah's journalism background had required her to develop expertise in digital forensics, cybersecurity, and information warfare that proved invaluable when investigating subjects who attempted to hide their activities behind technological barriers or institutional protection. Her contact database included law enforcement officials who specialized in crimes against educators, private investigators who could penetrate amateur security measures, and cybersecurity experts who owed her favors from previous collaborations on sensitive cases involving corruption and abuse of power. The woman the boys had dismissed as a powerless educator was actually a highly skilled investigator whose previous career had involved exposing corruption among people far more dangerous and sophisticated than high school bullies. Her transition to teaching had been motivated by a desire to shape young minds rather than simply document society's failures, but her investigative instincts and professional skills remained razor-sharp when faced with threats that required decisive action to protect herself and potential future victims. Her laptop's sophisticated software packages were already analyzing the boys' digital footprints, tracing their social media activity, and documenting evidence that would prove invaluable if legal action became necessary to address their behavior. Ms. Mitchell's preparation for this confrontation extended far beyond anything the boys could imagine, because her previous career had taught her to always maintain multiple contingency plans when dealing with hostile subjects who might attempt to use intimidation or violence to avoid accountability for their actions. The afternoon sun continued its westward journey as the confrontation in room 204 approached its inevitable climax, casting longer shadows through the windows while the boys prepared to implement the final phase of their scheme. Outside, Riverside High's campus remained largely empty except for scattered vehicles belonging to staff members and students involved in legitimate after-school activities, creating the isolation that had encouraged their plan while providing Ms. Mitchell with the privacy she needed to handle the situation without concerning herself with innocent witnesses who might be traumatized by whatever was about to unfold. Tyler's frustration with her continued resistance was becoming visible in his body language and vocal tone, signs that his usual intimidation tactics were failing against an opponent who refused to acknowledge his dominance or submit to pressure that had worked against every other adult he'd targeted. His basketball training had taught him to maintain composure under stress, but facing someone who operated by different rules, than those governing high school social dynamics was triggering. Anxiety and anger that threatened to overwhelm his strategic thinking and lead him toward more serious criminal behavior. Connor's social media expertise had convinced him that every situation could be manipulated through careful presentation and selective editing, but he was beginning to sense that their target possessed capabilities that extended beyond his understanding of normal adult responses to teenage intimidation. The young man's confidence in his ability to create compelling content was being undermined by Ms. Mitchell's refusal to play the victim role that was essential to their planned narrative, suggesting that their scheme might not unfold according to the script they'd developed during their preparation. Mason's privileged background had insulated him from situations where his family's influence proved insufficient to guarantee favorable outcomes, and he was experiencing the unfamiliar sensation of facing an opponent who seemed genuinely unimpressed by implied threats that usually ensured immediate compliance. The boy's understanding of power dynamics was based on negotiations and transactions rather than genuine conflict, leaving him unprepared for someone who might be willing to accept significant losses in order to inflict greater damage on her opponents. Derek's moral discomfort was intensifying as he recorded footage that would forever mark him as someone willing to commit serious crimes for the approval of people who viewed him as completely expendable. But his fear of social isolation continued to override his ethical objections to their increasingly criminal scheme. The boy's hands shook as he documented activity that violated numerous state and federal laws, creating evidence that would destroy his future regardless of whether their intimidation campaign achieved its immediate objectives. The classroom had become a powder keg of teenage arrogance and adult competence, with both sides committed to courses of action that could only end in decisive victory for one party and crushing defeat for the other. The boy's assumption that Miss Mitchell was helpless and isolated was about to be challenged by someone whose true capabilities remained hidden beneath a carefully maintained professional facade that had fooled them into believing she was vulnerable to their crude intimidation tactics. Miss Mitchell's fingers moved across her laptop keyboard with practiced precision, executing commands that would transform her from apparent victim to absolute controller of the situation. Unfolding in room 204, her journalism background had required mastery of digital investigation, techniques that went far beyond anything these boys could comprehend, and the sophisticated software running on her machine was already dissecting their digital lives with surgical accuracy. What appeared to be casual typing was actually the implementation of a comprehensive intelligence-gathering operation that would provide her with devastating leverage over each of her would-be tormentors. Tyler's confidence began to waver as he noticed Miss Mitchell's calm attention to her computer screen rather than his intimidating presence looming over her desk. His experience with successful intimidation campaigns had taught him that victims typically focused entirely on their tormentors once physical dominance was established, and her apparent distraction suggested a level of composure that didn't match his expectations. The basketball star had built his reputation on his ability to read opponents and exploit their psychological weaknesses, but Ms. Mitchell's behavior was unlike anything he'd encountered in previous confrontations with authority figures. "Are you even listening to me?" Tyler demanded, his voice rising with frustration as he realized that his carefully planned escalation wasn't producing the desired effect. His athletic training had emphasized the importance of maintaining psychological pressure until opponents cracked under the strain, but Ms. Mitchell seemed genuinely uninterested in his threats or the presence of his friends surrounding her position. The young man's confusion was growing as she continued typing with the focused attention of someone engaged in important work rather than cowering before superior numbers and social position. Connor's phone captured Tyler's increasing agitation. While the teenager began to sense that their scheme wasn't unfolding according to their carefully developed script, his social media experience had taught him to recognize the dramatic beats that created compelling content. And Ms. Mitchell's refusal to play her assigned victim role was disrupting the narrative flow that would make their video irresistible to online audiences. The young man's confidence in his ability to control public perception through selective editing was being challenged by source material that didn't conform to established patterns of teacher-student confrontations. Mason stepped closer to observe Ms. Mitchell's computer screen, his curiosity overriding the strategic positioning that was supposed to prevent her escape from their coordinated intimidation campaign. His family's business experience had taught him to pay attention when opponents displayed unexpected confidence during negotiations, because such behavior often indicated hidden resources or capabilities that could dramatically alter the balance of power. The boy's privileged upbringing had provided him with sophisticated understanding of how information could be weaponized in conflicts between seemingly unequal adversaries. Derek's phone continued recording upskirt footage that would serve as their ultimate leverage against Miss Mitchell's resistance, but his growing anxiety suggested that something fundamental had shifted in the classroom's power dynamics. His desperate need to maintain his position within the group had led him to commit serious crimes for people who viewed him as expendable, but his survival instincts were beginning to register warnings that their target might not be as helpless as they'd assumed. The boy's hands trembled as he documented activity that was creating evidence against him, regardless of their scheme's eventual outcome. Miss Mitchell's laptop screen displayed information that would have sent the boys fleeing in terror if they'd possessed the technical knowledge to understand what they were seeing, but their ignorance of cybersecurity and digital forensics was about to prove catastrophic for their futures. Her journalism career had required her to develop expertise in areas that extended far beyond traditional academic preparation, skills that proved invaluable when facing threats from subjects who'd underestimated her ability to gather intelligence and coordinate devastating responses to hostile behavior. The sophisticated software running on her machine had already penetrated the boys' social media accounts, cloud storage systems, and digital communications, revealing a treasure trove of incriminating evidence that documented years of harassment, academic fraud, and criminal activity. Her contact database included cybersecurity experts who could trace digital footprints back to their sources, law enforcement officials who specialized in crimes against educators, and investigative journalists who built their careers exposing corruption and abuse of power among people far more sophisticated than high school bullies. Sarah's investigation was revealing patterns of behavior that extended far beyond their current intimidation campaign, evidence of systematic harassment targeting multiple victims throughout their academic careers. Her analysis showed that Tyler, Connor, Mason, and Derek had refined their tactics through repeated attacks on substitute teachers, student teachers, and vulnerable classmates who lacked the resources or support necessary to resist their coordinated campaigns of psychological and social destruction. The documentation she was compiling would prove invaluable for both immediate legal action and long-term efforts to protect future victims from similar attacks. "Gentlemen," Ms. Mitchell said with deadly calm, her voice carrying a new authority that immediately commanded attention from all four boys. "I believe it's time we had an honest conversation about your academic performance and your future prospects at Riverside High." Her tone had shifted from professional educator to something far more dangerous, the voice of someone who'd spent years confronting corrupt politicians, corporate criminals, and violent subjects who tried to use intimidation to avoid accountability for their actions. Tyler's swagger faltered as he registered the change in her demeanor, his athlete's instincts warning him that the power dynamic in the classroom had somehow shifted without his awareness or understanding. His basketball training had taught him to recognize when opponents gained psychological advantage, but he couldn't identify what had changed or how to counter Miss Mitchell's newfound confidence. The young man's confusion was compounded by his friend's visible uncertainty, their coordinated intimidation campaign dissolving as they struggled to understand what was happening. Connor lowered his phone slightly as he realized that their target had somehow seized control of the situation, through means he couldn't comprehend. His social media expertise providing no guidance for handling an opponent who operated by rules that extended beyond his understanding of viral content creation. The teenager's confidence in his ability to manipulate public perception was crumbling as he faced someone whose media experience dwarfed his amateur social networking skills. His growing panic suggested that their scheme had encountered opposition that could neutralize all their carefully planned advantages. Mason stepped backward from Ms. Mitchell's desk as his survival instincts registered the shift in classroom dynamics, his privileged background providing enough sophistication to recognize when negotiations had moved beyond his family's traditional areas of influence. The boy's understanding of power structures was based on economic leverage and political connections rather than genuine conflict resolution, leaving him unprepared for someone who might possess resources that extended beyond small-town hierarchies. His retreat from her desk marked the beginning of his abandonment of their coordinated intimidation campaign. Derek's phone continued recording criminal activity that was creating evidence against him with each passing second, but his terror was intensifying as he realized that their target had somehow gained the upper hand through methods that remained completely mysterious to his limited understanding. The boy's desperation to maintain his position within the group was being overwhelmed by his growing recognition that their scheme had encountered opposition that could destroy all their futures regardless of their family connections or social positions within Riverside High student hierarchy. Ms. Mitchell's laptop displayed Tyler's complete academic record, including documentation of plagiarized assignments, forged parent signatures, and fraudulent excuse letters that had allowed him to maintain athletic eligibility despite chronic academic failures. Her investigation had revealed systematic cheating that extended throughout his high school career, evidence that would not only end his basketball scholarship prospects, but also trigger criminal charges for academic fraud that could follow him for years. The star athlete's carefully constructed reputation was about to crumble under the weight of documentation he'd assumed would remain hidden forever. Connor's social media accounts revealed a disturbing pattern of harassment targeting vulnerable students, with carefully edited videos designed to humiliate victims while portraying him and his friends as harmless pranksters. Ms. Mitchell's analysis showed that his content creation had caused measurable psychological damage to multiple targets, some of whom had required counseling or transferred schools to escape the online harassment campaigns he'd orchestrated. The evidence she'd compiled would support both civil lawsuits and criminal charges that could destroy his college prospects and future career opportunities. Mason's digital footprint exposed his family's illegal activities in far greater detail than any previous investigation had achieved, revealing tax evasion, bribery, and corruption that extended throughout Millbrook's business and political establishments. Miss Mitchell's journalistic expertise had allowed her to connect financial records, communication logs, and transaction data that painted a comprehensive picture of systematic criminal activity that could destroy the Reed family's reputation and wealth. The boy's assumption that his family's influence provided protection from consequences was about to be challenged by someone who understood how to expose and prosecute white-collar crime. Derek's participation in their harassment campaigns had been documented through metadata analysis that revealed his role in coordinating attacks against victims who couldn't defend themselves against their systematic intimidation tactics. Ms. Mitchell's investigation showed that his desperate loyalty to friends who viewed him as expendable had led him to commit numerous crimes that would result in serious legal consequences, regardless of his family's economic circumstances. The evidence against him was overwhelming and would prove impossible to explain away through the juvenile justice system's traditional reluctance to impose harsh penalties. Tyler Brooks, Ms. Mitchell said with prosecutorial precision, her voice cutting through the classroom's tension like a blade. Basketball scholarship to State University, full ride. Your ticket out of Millbrook and into the professional sports world you've dreamed about since childhood. Interesting how that scholarship offer specifically requires maintaining academic eligibility and demonstrating good character both on and off the court. I wonder how the coaches would react to learning about your extensive history of academic fraud, harassment, and criminal intimidation of school personnel. The basketball star's face went white as he realized that someone had gained access to information he'd assumed was safely hidden behind administrative bureaucracy and adult reluctance to investigate student misconduct thoroughly. His athletic achievements had always protected him from serious scrutiny of his academic performance, but Ms. Mitchell's investigation had apparently uncovered evidence that could destroy everything he'd worked toward throughout his high school career. The young man's hands began trembling as the full scope of his vulnerability became apparent. Connor Walsh, she continued with relentless efficiency, aspiring social media influencer with dreams of building a marketing empire like your parents' successful firm. Fascinating how your online content consistently targets vulnerable students for harassment while portraying yourself as a harmless content creator. I'm sure your parents would be thrilled to learn that their son has been using skills they taught him to orchestrate cyberbullying campaigns that have caused measurable psychological damage to multiple victims. I imagine their business clients would find such behavior quite concerning when choosing marketing partners. Connor's phone slipped from his nervous fingers as he recognized that his carefully constructed online persona was about to be exposed as a facade hiding systematic cruelty toward anyone he perceived as weak or different. His parents had built their marketing business on reputation and community trust, advantages that would evaporate if their clients learned about their son's activities. The teenager's confidence in his ability to control narratives through selective editing was proving useless against someone who possessed complete documentation of his actual behavior patterns. Mason Reed, Ms. Mitchell said with the calm authority of someone who'd spent years exposing corruption among powerful families, heir to Millbrook's most influential dynasty, destined for Ivy League education and eventual control of the family business empire. How unfortunate that your family's recent tax strategies constitute clear violations of federal law, and their charitable foundation appears to be nothing more than an elaborate money laundering operation. I'm certain the Internal Revenue Service and FBI would find my documentation quite compelling when building their cases against systematic financial crimes. Mason's arrogant confidence crumbled as he realized that someone had gained access to financial information that his family had spent enormous resources protecting from government scrutiny, evidence that could destroy their wealth, reputation, and freedom if presented to appropriate authorities. His privileged upbringing had insulated him from the reality that actions have consequences, but Ms. Mitchell's investigation had apparently uncovered crimes that even his family's political connections couldn't protect them from facing. Boy's legs felt weak as the magnitude of his family's vulnerability became clear. And Derek Stone, she concluded with almost gentle precision, loyal friend willing to sacrifice everything for people who view you as completely expendable, desperate to maintain your position within a group that would abandon you the moment your usefulness expired. Your participation in their harassment campaigns has been thoroughly documented, creating evidence that will result in serious criminal charges, regardless of your economic circumstances or the manipulation you've endured from your supposed friends. Derek's phone clattered to the floor as his trembling hands could no longer maintain their grip, the device automatically stopping its illegal recording as it struck the linoleum. His desperate loyalty to friends who'd never genuinely cared about his well-being had led him to commit crimes that would haunt him for years, evidence that Miss Mitchell had apparently compiled with devastating thoroughness. The boy's fear of social isolation had driven him toward behavior that would result in consequences far worse than anything he'd tried to avoid. The four boys stood frozen in room 204 as the full scope of their vulnerability became apparent. Their coordinated intimidation campaign transformed into a nightmare scenario where their intended victim had somehow gained complete control over their futures. Ms. Mitchell's calm professionalism contrasted sharply with their growing panic, as they realized that someone possessed evidence that could destroy everything they'd worked toward throughout their academic careers. Tyler's basketball scholarship, Connor's social media aspirations, Mason's family empire, and Derek's desperate bid for acceptance were all hanging by threads that Ms. Mitchell could cut with a few keystrokes or phone calls to appropriate authorities. Their assumption that she was helpless and isolated had proven catastrophically wrong, revealing capabilities and resources that extended far beyond anything they'd encountered in previous confrontations with authority figures who'd eventually submitted to their pressure campaigns. "Now then," Ms. Mitchell said with deadly calm, her laptop screen displaying evidence that would terrorize them if they could fully comprehend its implications. "I believe you gentlemen wanted to discuss your academic performance and future prospects at Riverside High. Perhaps we should start with your immediate plans for improving your behavior and making amends for the harm you've inflicted on your victims throughout your academic careers." The boys exchanged panicked glances as they recognized that their roles had been completely reversed, transforming them from confident predators into helpless prey facing someone whose capabilities far exceeded their ability to comprehend or counter. Their crude intimidation tactics had proven useless against someone who understood power dynamics at a professional level that made their amateur harassment techniques seem pathetically inadequate by comparison. Connor scrambled to retrieve his dropped phone while desperately trying to delete the footage he'd recorded, his social media expertise finally proving useful as he attempted to eliminate evidence of their criminal activity. His fingers flew across the screen with practiced efficiency, but his panic was interfering with his technical skills as he realized that digital deletion was rarely permanent when facing someone with Ms. Mitchell's investigative background and resources. Mason pressed himself against the classroom wall as his privileged confidence evaporated under the weight of genuine consequences that his family's influence couldn't protect him from facing. His understanding of power structures had been based on negotiations between willing participants rather than genuine conflict with someone who possessed evidence of serious crimes. The boys' retreat marked his complete abandonment of their coordinated intimidation campaign as survival instincts overrode loyalty to his friends. Derek curled into himself as the magnitude of his situation became clear, his desperate loyalty to people who'd never genuinely cared about his well-being having led him to commit crimes that would destroy his future regardless of their scheme's outcome. The boy's terror was overwhelming as he realized that Ms. Mitchell possessed evidence that would result in consequences far more severe than the social isolation he'd tried so desperately to avoid through his participation in their harassment campaigns. Tyler stood frozen behind Ms. Mitchell's desk as his athletic swagger dissolved under the realization that someone had gained access to information that could end his BSSK-TBLL career and destroy his college prospects with devastating efficiency. His experience intimidating weaker opponents had provided no preparation for facing someone who operated by rules that extended far beyond high school social hierarchies and athletic achievements. Miss Mitchell's calm demeanor masked a satisfaction that came from watching bullies experience the fear and helplessness they'd inflicted on countless victims throughout their academic careers. Her journalism background had taught her that exposing corruption and holding powerful people accountable required both patience and precision, qualities that were serving her well as she systematically dismantled their assumptions about their own invulnerability. "I think you'll find," she said with professional precision, "that your immediate future depends entirely on your willingness to make meaningful changes to your behavior and attitudes. The evidence I've compiled documents years of harassment, academic fraud, and criminal activity that would interest numerous law enforcement agencies and educational authorities. However, I'm prepared to discuss alternatives to criminal prosecution, assuming you demonstrate genuine commitment to reform." The boys recognized that their only hope for avoiding catastrophic consequences lay in complete submission to whatever terms Miss Mitchell chose to impose. Their coordinated intimidation campaign having backfired so spectacularly that they now faced destruction of everything they'd worked toward throughout their academic careers. Their assumption that educators were helpless against student harassment had proven tragically wrong when applied to someone whose capabilities extended far beyond traditional academic authority. Tyler's basketball scholarship, Connor's social media empire, Mason's family legacy, and Derek's desperate bid for acceptance now hung in the balance as they awaited judgment from someone they'd dismissed as a powerless target for their crude entertainment. The reversal was complete, their intended victim having revealed herself to be their judge, jury, and potential executioner in a confrontation they'd initiated but could no longer control or escape. Ms. Mitchell's investigation had transformed their harassment campaign into a comprehensive case study of systematic bullying that would serve as evidence for years to come. Documentation that could protect future victims while ensuring that Tyler, Connor, Mason, and Derek never again felt confident enough to target vulnerable educators or students. The woman they'd underestimated had proven to be exactly the wrong person to intimidate. Her skills and resources perfectly suited to neutralizing their threats while gathering evidence that would haunt them for years. The afternoon sun had completed its westward journey as the confrontation in room 204 reached its inevitable conclusion. 4 teenage bullies, discovering that their intended victim possessed capabilities that transformed their crude intimidation scheme into a masterclass in professional investigation and strategic response. Their assumption that Ms. Mitchell was helpless and isolated had proven catastrophically wrong, revealing hidden depths that made their amateur harassment techniques seem pathetically inadequate against someone who'd spent years exposing corruption among far more dangerous adversaries. The silence in room 204 stretched for what felt like an eternity as 4 teenage boys grappled with the complete collapse of their carefully orchestrated intimidation scheme. Miss Mitchell's revelation of her true capabilities had transformed the power dynamic so thoroughly that Tyler, Connor, Mason, and Derek found themselves in the unfamiliar position of facing an adult who possessed both the evidence and the expertise necessary to destroy their futures with surgical precision. Their assumption that educators were helpless against student harassment had proven catastrophically wrong when applied to someone whose investigative background provided resources they couldn't begin to comprehend. Tyler's athletic confidence had evaporated entirely as he processed the implications of Miss Mitchell's knowledge about his academic fraud and scholarship requirements. The basketball star who'd built his reputation on intimidating weaker opponents now stood trembling behind her desk, his carefully constructed image crumbling under the weight of documentation that could end his college prospects and athletic career with devastating efficiency. His hands shook as he realized that someone possessed evidence of systematic cheating that extended throughout his high school years, violations that would trigger immediate suspension from the team and cancellation of scholarship offers that represented his only path to higher education. "Please," Tyler whispered, his voice barely audible as the magnitude of his vulnerability became clear. "I'll do anything you want. Just don't destroy my future over some stupid grades." His plea represented a complete reversal from the arrogant demands he'd made just minutes earlier, his desperation evident as he begged for mercy from someone he'd tried to intimidate into submission. The young man's recognition that his athletic achievements meant nothing against evidence of academic fraud marked the beginning of his psychological transformation from predator to supplicant. Connor's social media expertise had proven useless against someone who understood digital investigation at a professional level that made his amateur content creation skills seem pathetically inadequate. The teenager's hands trembled as he continued attempting to delete the incriminating footage he'd recorded, but his panic was interfering with his technical abilities as he realized that permanent, Deletion was nearly impossible when facing someone with Miss Mitchell's investigative resources. His carefully crafted online persona as a harmless content creator was about to be exposed as a facade hiding systematic cruelty toward vulnerable victims. The cyberbullying documentation alone would interest several law enforcement agencies. Ms. Mitchell observed with clinical detachment, her tone suggesting that Connor's digital crimes represented just the beginning of his legal troubles. Your parents' marketing business depends on community trust and positive reputation, advantages that would evaporate immediately if their clients learned about their son's activities. I imagine they've worked too hard building their company to watch it destroyed by your harassment campaigns against vulnerable students. Mason pressed himself against the classroom wall as his privileged confidence disintegrated under the realization that his family's wealth and political connections provided no protection against federal criminal charges backed by comprehensive documentation. The boy's understanding of power dynamics had been based on local influence and economic leverage rather than genuine conflict with someone who possessed evidence of serious crimes that extended far beyond Millbrook's small-town hierarchies. His retreat from their coordinated intimidation campaign marked his complete abandonment of friends, who were now liabilities rather than allies. The financial crimes documentation is particularly compelling. Ms. Mitchell continued with prosecutorial precision, her investigation having uncovered evidence that could destroy the Reed family's empire through tax evasion and money laundering. Charges. Your great-grandfather's business legacy would become a cautionary tale about corruption and criminal enterprise, assuming federal prosecutors decide to pursue the extensive evidence I've compiled. I'm certain the FBI's white-collar crime division would find my research quite valuable when building their cases. Derek had collapsed into a nearby chair as the full scope of his participation in criminal harassment became apparent, his desperate loyalty to friends who viewed him as expendable having led him to document evidence against himself through his illegal recording activities. The boy's terror was overwhelming as he realized that Miss Mitchell possessed proof of crimes that would result in serious legal consequences regardless of his family's economic circumstances or his status as a juvenile. His fear of social isolation had driven him toward behavior that would create far worse consequences than anything he'd tried to avoid. Your recording device captured excellent evidence of attempted voyeurism and conspiracy to commit sexual harassment, Ms. Mitchell noted with almost gentle precision, her tone acknowledging Garrick's victimization by his supposed friends, while making clear that his participation in criminal activity would still have consequences. The footage you created would serve as primary evidence in criminal proceedings, assuming authorities decide to prosecute the extensive crimes documented in this classroom today. The four boys exchanged panicked glances as they began to understand that their roles had been completely reversed, their intended victim having revealed capabilities that transformed them from confident predators into helpless prey facing someone whose expertise extended far beyond traditional academic authority. Ms. Mitchell's calm professionalism contrasted sharply with their growing hysteria as they recognized that their coordinated harassment campaign had backfired so spectacularly that they now faced potential destruction of everything they'd worked toward throughout their academic careers. Ms. Mitchell's laptop screen continued displaying evidence that would have sent them fleeing in terror if they'd possessed the technical knowledge to fully comprehend its implications. Comprehensive documentation that connected years of harassment, fraud, and criminal activity into patterns that revealed the systematic nature of their behavior. Her journalism background had provided her with investigative tools that these amateur bullies couldn't begin to counter, skills developed through years of exposing corruption among subjects far more dangerous and sophisticated than high school students drunk on privilege and social status. However, she said with measured calm, her tone shifting slightly to suggest the possibility of alternatives to complete destruction, I'm not interested in ruining young lives unnecessarily, assuming you demonstrate genuine commitment to meaningful change. The evidence I've compiled serves multiple purposes, including protection for future victims and documentation of systematic problems within Riverside High's disciplinary structure. Your cooperation could prove valuable in addressing these broader issues." Tyler's head snapped up at the suggestion that complete disaster might be avoidable, his athlete's instincts recognizing the opening that Ms. Mitchell had deliberately provided for negotiation rather than unconditional surrender. His basketball training had taught him to recognize when opponents offered opportunities to recover from disadvantageous positions, but his limited understanding of adult psychology left him uncertain about how to respond to someone whose motivations extended beyond simple revenge or dominance. "What do you want from us?" Tyler asked with desperate hope, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had characterized his earlier demands. "I'll change my behavior, retake the classes properly, whatever it takes to fix this situation." His offer represented genuine panic rather than calculated manipulation, his recognition that Miss Mitchell held absolute power over his future, forcing him to abandon intimidation tactics that had served him throughout his academic career. Connor looked up from his phone with tear-filled eyes as he realized that his attempts to delete incriminating evidence were probably futile against someone with Miss Mitchell's technical expertise, his social media skills proving inadequate against professional-level digital investigation. The teenager's carefully constructed confidence in his ability to control narratives through selective editing had crumbled under the weight of comprehensive documentation that revealed the true scope of his harassment campaigns against vulnerable students. "I never meant to hurt anyone seriously," Connor lied desperately, his voice cracking as he attempted to minimize his responsibility for systematic cruelty that had caused measurable psychological damage to multiple victims. "The videos were just supposed to be funny content, not actual harassment. I'll delete everything and apologize to everyone if you'll just give me another chance to prove I can change." His plea revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of the harm he'd inflicted while demonstrating his willingness to accept any terms that might preserve his future prospects. Mason remained pressed against the wall as his privileged worldview collapsed under the realization that money and family connections provided no protection against federal criminal charges backed by irrefutable evidence, his understanding of power dynamics proving inadequate when facing someone who operated by rules that extended far beyond local political hierarchies. The boy's retreat from their intimidation campaign had become a complete psychological surrender, as he recognized that his family's empire could be destroyed by someone who understood how to expose and prosecute white-collar crime. "My family's lawyers can work with you," Mason offered with pathetic desperation, his voice betraying his recognition that traditional damage control methods would prove useless against someone who possessed evidence of systematic financial crimes. "We can make donations to anti-bullying programs, fund educational initiatives, whatever would demonstrate our commitment to making things right. Please don't destroy everything my family has built over generations because of my stupid mistakes." Derek's sobbing had intensified as the magnitude of his situation became fully apparent, his desperate loyalty to friends who'd manipulated him into criminal behavior having created evidence that would haunt him, regardless of their schemes. Outcome. The boy's terror was overwhelming as he realized that Ms. Mitchell possessed documentation of crimes that would result in consequences far more severe than the social isolation he'd tried to avoid through his participation in harassment campaigns against innocent victims. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," Derek whispered through his tears, his voice barely audible as he acknowledged his participation in systematic cruelty while recognizing that his supposed friends had viewed him as completely expendable throughout their relationship. "I just wanted to belong somewhere, and I let them convince me to do terrible things to people who never hurt me. I'll accept whatever punishment you think is fair if you'll help me figure out how to make things right with the people we hurt." Ms. Mitchell observed their desperate pleas with the analytical detachment she developed during her journalism career, Her experience with corrupt subjects, having taught her to distinguish between genuine remorse and calculated manipulation, designed to avoid consequences. The boys' panic was obviously authentic, but their willingness to change would need to be demonstrated through actions, rather than words if she was going to consider alternatives to complete exposure of their criminal activities. Your futures depend entirely on your commitment to meaningful reform, she said with prosecutorial precision, her tone making clear that any agreement would include comprehensive monitoring and strict accountability measures. The evidence I've compiled will remain available for use if you fail to demonstrate genuine change, and any backsliding toward your previous behavior patterns will result in immediate release of all documentation to appropriate authorities. Tyler nodded frantically as he processed the possibility that his basketball career might be salvageable if he could prove his commitment to legitimate academic achievement and behavioral reform, his athletic training providing him with understanding of discipline and goal-oriented improvement that could serve him well in earning Miss Biles' conditional mercy. The star player's recognition that his future depended on someone else's evaluation of his character marked a fundamental shift in his psychology from entitled predator to accountable student. I'll retake every class legitimately, Tyler promised. With desperate sincerity, his voice carrying genuine commitment as he recognized that his only path forward required abandoning the academic fraud that had enabled his athletic career. No more cheating, no more intimidation, no more using my status to avoid consequences. I'll prove that I can succeed through actual effort and legitimate achievement. His offer represented a complete reversal of the attitudes that had characterized his academic career, genuine terror having accomplished what years of adult intervention had failed to achieve. Connor's social media expertise suddenly provided him with understanding of how comprehensive documentation could be used to monitor and verify behavioral changes over extended periods, his technical skills finally proving useful for constructive rather than destructive purposes. The teenager's recognition that Miss Mitchell could track his online activities indefinitely forced him to consider genuine reform rather than temporary compliance followed by return to previous harassment patterns. I'll use my technical skills to help victims instead of hurting them, Connor offered with genuine remorse, his voice reflecting his growing understanding of the psychological damage his content creation had inflicted on vulnerable students. I can create positive content that promotes anti-bullying initiatives, document real stories of students who've overcome harassment, maybe even work with counselors to help victims recover from the damage people like me have caused. His proposal represented genuine recognition of his responsibility to make amends for years of systematic cruelty. Mason's family background had provided him with sophisticated understanding of negotiation and conflict resolution that could serve him well in developing comprehensive restitution plans that addressed both immediate harm and long-term prevention of similar incidents, his privileged education finally proving useful for constructive rather than destructive purposes. The boys' recognition that his family's resources could be redirected toward positive community impact marked a fundamental shift in his understanding of wealth and responsibility. Our family foundation can fund comprehensive anti-bullying programs throughout the district, Mason proposed with desperate sincerity, his voice reflecting his recognition that meaningful change would require sustained financial commitment rather than temporary gestures. We can endow scholarships for students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, create counseling resources for harassment victims, maybe even establish educational programs that teach students about the long-term consequences of bullying behavior. His offer represented genuine understanding that his family's wealth carried responsibilities that extended beyond personal advancement. Derek's participation in their harassment campaigns had been motivated primarily by his desperate need for acceptance rather than genuine malice, and his recognition of how his supposed friends had manipulated his vulnerabilities could serve as valuable insight for helping Other students resist similar exploitation by predatory social groups. The boy's willingness to acknowledge his victimization while accepting responsibility for his criminal behavior demonstrated psychological maturity that could prove valuable in educational settings. I want to help other kids like me understand how groups like ours work, Derek offered through his tears, his voice carrying genuine commitment as he recognized his unique perspective on the psychological manipulation that enabled systematic harassment. I can talk to counselors about the pressure tactics they used on me, help identify students who might be vulnerable to similar exploitation, maybe even work with teachers to recognize the warning signs when kids are being pushed toward criminal behavior by people who don't actually care about them. Ms. Mitchell's laptop displayed comprehensive behavioral modification plans that incorporated the boys' individual strengths and circumstances into accountability structures designed to ensure genuine reform rather than temporary compliance, followed by return to previous patterns, her investigative expertise proving valuable for constructive as well as punitive purposes. Her journalism background had taught her that sustainable change required addressing underlying motivations and systemic factors rather than simply punishing individual incidents. Your reform plans will be monitored through comprehensive tracking systems that verify behavioral changes across multiple domains, she explained with clinical precision, her tone making clear that any agreement would include extensive oversight and verification measures. Academic performance, social interactions, online activities, and community involvement will all be documented and evaluated on an ongoing basis to ensure compliance with established improvement benchmarks. Tyler's athletic training had taught him to accept coaching and performance evaluation as necessary components of improvement, and his recognition that Ms. Meffill's monitoring would serve similar functions helped him psychologically frame accountability as opportunity rather than punishment. The basketball star's competitive instincts could be redirected toward achieving legitimate academic and social goals rather than dominating weaker opponents through intimidation and fraud. Connor's social media expertise would be redirected toward documenting his own behavioral changes and creating content that promoted positive community values rather than harassment and division. His technical skills serving constructive purposes under Ms. Mitchell's guidance and oversight. The teenager's understanding of audience engagement could prove valuable for anti-bullying initiatives that reach students through platforms and methods they actually used rather than traditional educational approaches they typically ignored. Mason's family resources would be systematically deployed toward community improvement initiatives that addressed the root causes of harassment and provided support for victims of systematic bullying, his privileged background finally serving purposes that extended beyond personal advancement and social domination. The boy's understanding of organizational structure and project management could prove valuable for implementing sustainable programs rather than temporary gestures designed to avoid consequences. Derek's psychological insights into manipulation and exploitation would be channeled toward helping other vulnerable students recognize and resist predatory social dynamics that enabled systematic harassment, his personal experience providing credibility and understanding that professional counselors might lack when working with similar cases. The boy's willingness to acknowledge his own victimization while accepting responsibility for his criminal behavior demonstrated emotional maturity that could prove valuable in educational and therapeutic settings. Ms. Mitchell's comprehensive reform program would address not only the immediate behavior of Tyler, Connor, Mason, and Derek, but also the systemic factors within Riverside High's culture that had enabled their harassment campaigns to continue unchecked for years. Her investigation having revealed institutional failures that required administrative attention and policy changes. Her documentation would serve as evidence for broader reforms designed to protect future victims, while ensuring that similar incidents were detected and addressed before escalating to criminal levels. The four boys' recognition that their futures depended entirely on Miss Mitchell's evaluation of their progress created psychological motivation for genuine change rather than superficial compliance, their terror of exposure serving as powerful incentive for sustained behavioral modification over extended periods. Their understanding that comprehensive documentation of their activities would remain available for immediate release if they failed to demonstrate genuine reform eliminated any possibility of returning to previous harassment patterns without facing devastating consequences. Tyler's basketball scholarship would remain contingent on demonstrated academic integrity and positive community involvement, his athletic achievements serving as motivation for legitimate success rather than excuse for continued harassment of vulnerable students and educators. Connor's social media activities would be monitored and evaluated for positive community impact, his technical skills redirected toward constructive content creation that promoted anti-bullying initiatives rather than systematic harassment. Mason's family resources would be committed to long-term community improvement programs that addressed the underlying causes of harassment and provided support for victims, his privileged background serving purposes that extended beyond personal advancement. Derek's insights into manipulation and exploitation would be channeled toward helping other vulnerable students recognize and resist predatory social dynamics, his personal experience providing valuable perspective for educational and therapeutic interventions. The transformation of Room 204 from scene of attempted harassment to center of comprehensive behavioral reform marked a fundamental shift in power dynamics at Riverside High, Ms. Mitchell's investigation having revealed capabilities that extended far beyond traditional academic authority while establishing accountability structures that would protect future victims from similar attacks. The boys' recognition that their intended victim possessed resources they couldn't comprehend or counter had transformed their crude intimidation scheme into masterclass in professional investigation and strategic response to systematic harassment. The afternoon sun had set as the confrontation reached its conclusion, four teenage bullies having discovered that their assumptions about adult helplessness were catastrophically wrong when applied to someone whose capabilities extended far beyond traditional educational backgrounds. Their intended victim had proven to be exactly the wrong person to intimidate, her skills and resources perfectly suited to neutralizing their threats, while gathering evidence that would serve as protection for future victims and motivation for their own genuine reform. Miss Mitchell's calm professionalism had transformed a harassment incident into comprehensive case study of systematic bullying that would serve educational and legal purposes for years to come. Her investigation providing documentation that could protect countless future victims while ensuring that Tyler, Connor, Mason, and Derek never again felt confident enough to target vulnerable educators or students. The woman they'd underestimated had proven to possess exactly the capabilities necessary to hold them accountable while offering pathways toward genuine redemption through sustained behavioral change and community service. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.